It's kind of wild for me to think. I mean, time is just an interesting thing, but it's wild to think that we're kind of already 5 days in. This is the fifth day, so January 5th that I'm recording this. And today's topic is going to potentially be I don't know, maybe a little bit controversial in some ways. So, bear with me on this. And if it ruffles your feather, reach out, let's talk, or drop some comments. But I'm just going to also remind you, like, subscribe, do all of those crazy things. I love doing this. It doesn't matter where you're watching this or listening to, but whatever platform you're on, just try to engage. That tells me to keep doing it. So, yeah, if any of you have ever stepped into AA, there is a chance that you have had the same question asked to you that I did. Probably more than once, probably from almost anyone that you were around, right? And those questions: have you found a sponsor? Do you have a sponsor? Right? And this, for me, it didn't matter who I was talking to. Men were asking this, women were asking this, people that were kind of newer to the program, people that had, you know, been in the program for a really long time. And this message was really consistent and it was certainly well intentioned. If I was serious about recovery, I needed to have a sponsor. And so, of course, I was very serious. I had already tried to get sober twice that year on my own and had relapsed. So I came into these rooms, into this, program, committed to doing whatever it is that I was told I needed to do, right? So regardless of how uncomfortable it was for me to like approach strangers and say, "Hey, can you be my sponsor?" I did it. And over the course of October and November, maybe even into December, I think probably even into December, I had reached out to 5 different women, right? All of them had given me their numbers. So, I text some folks, I talked on the phone, I met a handful of them for coffee. And these were really lovely conversations. I remember very specifically one of the women, shared that she could see a lot of her own story in my story. She was the one that had introduced me to Al Anon. She'd also introduced me to ACA, which is the Adult Children Alcoholics. She kind of called me like a triple threat. She said, "You're, a recovering addict. You grew up in addict household, and you're in a relationship with an addict. Like, that's a lot. Like, that is a lot." And I appreciated every one of these conversations, but they all told me no. Every woman had a very valid reason. One of them had lost someone recently. Many of them just stated, "I don't have time. I have, 5 other women that I'm sponsoring right now." They didn't have the space. Um, and I accepted it. I wasn't mad. I wasn't angry, but I was just like, is this supposed to be this hard? Right? I assumed that this was just part of the process. Like everyone kind of went through this. And I've since been told that's not the case. I've told it's been very uncommon to get, 5 no's. Like I think every person in the program I've told this story to has made that comment to me. Right. Looking back, I can see that something else was happening. Spirit was involving itself in my recovery right now, even though I didn't realize it. Yeah, right. One thing that does surprise people, because I've done some studies, I've done some research around, AA, around the 12-step programs, um, and its history. And sponsorship didn't exist in the beginning of AA, right? When Bill W. originally created it, sponsorship was not part of the big book, right? AA was considered to be this kind of mutual, relational, shared experience of like, hey, we are all trying to do this together. Let's like not do it alone. Or all trying to do the same thing. Let's not do it alone. And the word sponsor didn't, like I said, wasn't in the big book at all. Sponsorship didn't emerge, if I am quoting my research correctly, until like the 60s or the 70s, really, when AA in and of itself became much larger, right? And it became a way to kind of ensure that the program and the message of AA was, transferring to newcomers in the meetings. Like it wasn't getting lost, right? That people weren't just showing up to show up. They knew what they were meant to do. So in other words, it was meant as guidance, not any type of authority, support, not any type of control, like this temporary scaffolding, right? But not necessarily a lifelong oversight, you know? And I think back because I read the big book, I read the 12 traditions, I read pretty much anything I could get my hands on, and I don't recall a lot of it talking about any history or story kind of around this role. Um, and so, yeah, the distinction matters when we're talking about sponsorship, that it was meant as this guidance and support, not authority and control, because somewhere along the way, I believe that got blurred. Um, I think it was around the end of December when I finally did, maybe even the beginning of January when I finally had a sponsor, that showed up. And I say showed up because one of the women I had talked to um, recommended that I reach out to one of her sponsees. Um, she thought that she was ready to sponsor. And this person had been in the program 3 years. They'd been sober for 3 years. They were closer to my age. So I really did feel hopeful. We met for coffee and we agreed to move forward. And, like a lot of the sponsee sponsor relationships, we talked on the phone, we text messaged, and we agreed to meet either before or after one of the regular meetings that we attended and work the steps. Right. And for the first time, I felt like I could actually speak freely because up until this point in these meetings, yes, I was talking, yes, I was sharing, but I wasn't sharing the whole witch, if you know what I mean. Right? I felt like this was the first time I could truly speak freely about my journey and the things that were unfolding for me. What I couldn't see though was what my openness was stirring inside of her. Yeah. Before I go any further, I do want to talk about how sponsorship can be very powerful, right? It can work for a lot of people. It really can. Peer support in and of itself has been proven to be a really strong indicator of recovery success. The reality is shame thrives in isolation, and there's something incredibly regulating about talking to someone that has walked through the same fire and lived to tell the story. Having someone that can answer your phone anytime that your thoughts are spiraling can be a lifesaver, right? And your therapist isn't going to do that, right? They're just not. Early recovery can be very chaotic for people, and this relationship can feel like a lifeline. The reality is, for a lot of people, sponsorship provides safety, clarity, and hope. And I really want to honor that truth. The problem that I'm talking about and sharing here today isn't the fact that sponsorship exists. The problem is that it's often treated as a universally necessary and universally safe thing. At the end of the day, what we rarely talk about when it comes to sponsorship is that these sponsors are unpaid, they're unlicensed, they're unregulated, and they receive no standardized training around trauma, mental health, boundaries, ethics, or even power dynamics, right? If you've ever talked to anybody else in a 12-step program and talked about their relationships with their sponsors, the quality of a sponsorship varies widely from deeply grounded and compassionate to rigid, controlling, and even folks that are unintentionally harming their sponsee. Don't get me wrong, harm is not coming from bad intentions most of the time. It's coming from this structured relationship that has zero safeguards and put into it. And over time, this role of the sponsor has just quietly expanded, right? In a lot of spaces, the folks that I've spoken to, the sponsor is not just someone that walks you through the steps. They become kind of your moral compass, right? A spiritual authority, an interpreter of what is right or wrong in recovery. If any of you have ever watched the TV show Mom, you're going to see this. All of these people, I can't remember what her name was, but all of these folks in that program would call the older one, the one that had had like 28 years in recovery, every time that they kind of needed to make a big decision to make the determination of if it was right or wrong. And I know there's going to be a lot of folks that argue with me on that. But this right here is where things can start to go sideways. It was in March, maybe even April, but I think it was probably March, end of March, right around when the world had begun to shut down because of the pandemic. And my sponsor sent me a text and asked if we had time to talk. And I said yes and called her back. She told me she had made some really big decisions in her life and she needed to share them with me. Two of them were leaving AA. She was leaving AA, the program of AA, completely, and leaving her church. Not only was she choosing to no longer be my sponsor, she didn't want to be involved in the 12-step program anymore. She didn't want to be involved in the church that her and her husband had been attending for I don't even know how many years. And I was stunned. I wasn't angry. I wasn't betrayed. I was just really, really surprised, right? And the reality is I was happy for her because I could feel at this time, right now, I was almost 6 months into recovery. My intuition was a lot sharper at this. I could feel that these choices were really aligned with where she needed to be going. Didn't change the fact that I was shaken. I had done everything that this 12-step program had told me to do. I'd found a sponsor. I was working the steps. I was showing up. And now my sponsor was leaving. I didn't know how to describe this. It just felt really strange and odd. Looking back, I now know and understand this is one of the clearest interventions Spirit had, right? Spirit did this for me. Well, let's talk a little bit about the psychology beneath the surface. And I think this is important for us to understand. The sponsor role, in and of itself, blends functions that are usually kept separate for ethical reasons, if we think about in the mental health world, right? A sponsor, in and of itself, can become a peer, somebody on your level, a mentor, somebody you look up to, a crisis contact, somebody you turn to in an emergency, a moral guide, somebody that can provide you direction of right or wrong, as well as a spiritual authority. What should I truly believe all at once? That's a lot. And for people with secure attachment and a little bit of trauma history, even just a little bit, that might not be a problem, right? Secure attachment, just a little bit of trauma, might not be a problem, right? They can navigate that. But for people like me, and for a lot of the witches that I've spoken to, it's risky AF territory. Risky as fuck, right? I carry authority trauma. I grew up learning that connection often required compliance, right? In order for me to receive love from my father, I had to comply with what he expected of me. I carry religious trauma from systems that taught obedience over intuition, right? Systems that taught you that you just listened and you believed what you were told rather than trusting. I also have a long history of codependency and people pleasing. I am very good at attaching deeply to one person and making them my emotional and spiritual center, right? I am. For a long time, that person had been my best friend, who I was actively using with for quite a long time. Maybe she wasn't actively using with me because she hid a lot of her, drug addiction. But I certainly was actively using with her. And later, it was my partner. I wasn't afraid of vulnerability. I could be open and I could be vulnerable with them. I was afraid of losing connection. Spirit could see what I could not name. I didn't need another one-to-one relationship where my recovery depended on someone else's stability or belief system, right? Or what they said or what they shared. What I needed was community. I needed a shared responsibility instead of a single point of emotional gravity. I needed to learn how to be more vulnerable with more than one person, right? I needed to learn how to receive support without collapsing into dependency. And most of all, I needed to reclaim my own inner authority. I needed to learn how to listen to spirit. At the time, losing a sponsor felt a bit like a failure. And in retrospect, it was protection. Every no I heard before her, every door that didn't open, even her decision to leave, none of it was random. Spirit was taking something away from me. They were keeping me from repeating a pattern that I was actively trying to heal. So, my dear witches, this is where I want to speak directly to you, especially if you identify as a spiritually autonomous person already. Or if you're exploring your path of, like, had been called to this path of witchcraft, you are being called to a path of sovereignty. Many of us witches, my dear, carry a very specific constellation of experiences: authority trauma from caregivers, religious trauma from rigid spiritual systems, and a deep history of codependency and people pleasing. When those patterns meet a hierarchical sponsorship model, even a very, very well intentioned one, the nervous system recognizes something familiar. Questioning their guidance can feel dangerous. Discomfort can turn into shame, and silence feels safer than dissent. So people often are going to leave these programs quietly, not because they don't want to recover, but not because they're unwilling, but because their bodies are showing them that something is off and they can't name it. One of the hardest things that I see now over and over again is how much shame, overwhelming, burdensome shame people carry when a recovery program doesn't work for them. They assume that they're doing it wrong. They assume that their ego is broken. They assume that they're just broken. And I believe that, like they were little bits and pieces. And I'm very grateful that I had a therapist that, I could talk to with these things through, right? And I'm very glad for my relationship that I developed with spirit, because now I know better. Sometimes what we see or feel as resistance is actually wisdom. Sometimes what looks like a failure is discernment, and sometimes spirit steps in not to punish us but protect us. Yeah. I want to be clear. Sponsorship in and of itself is not inherently harmful. It's also not inherently safe. At its best, at its absolute best, it is a peer mentorship that is rooted in humility, clear boundaries, and a shared goal of autonomy. At its worst, it becomes unexamined power wrapped in a spiritual language. Recovery is meant to restore wholeness. It's meant to help you reclaim who you are truly meant to be. It should lead us back to ourselves, not ask us to silence our intuition in the name of compliance. Spirit didn't abandon me when sponsorship fell away. It guided me toward a path that was communal, spacious, and aligned with who I actually am. If this stirs something up in you right now, if you've softened, if you feel seen, I want you to know that you're not alone. So many of us witches in recovery are not looking for someone to tell us what to do. They're looking for connection. They're looking for community. They're looking for a place where they don't have to shrink, perform, or surrender their intuition, their beliefs in a god and a goddess, and all these lovely, wonderful, magical things that we have in our lives. And that's why I created the Recovery Comet. It's been amazing hearing the responses that people have shared of how grateful they feel to have found it. Because it's a community centered space for all of us witches in recovery that are ready to heal in connection. We don't have a sponsorship model, right? There's no spiritual authority over you. Like, as the high priestess, I share my journey. That's my goal, my journey and the things that I've learned. And that's about it, right? I'm actually here to encourage you to be sovereign, to be yourself, to celebrate you when you are. In the Recovery Coven, you're going to find shared responsibility. You're going to find honest conversations, rituals, reflections, and, people that care for you. So I'd like to see you join. I know I don't often make a hard ask at the end of these, but give it some consideration. I think that you would find that you love it. Yeah. So, until next time, my dear friends, much love from me to all of you.